Good morning, everyone, and good evening for those tuning in from elsewhere. My name is Chad Toprak. I'm the director of Freeplay, and this is our first session for day 2. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Freeplay hosts and broadcasts from the stolen lands of the Wurundjeri and Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, where stories have been shared and games have been played since time immemorial. We pay our respects to elders past and present, and to anyone watching who has a connection to the world's oldest living culture. Sovereignty was never ceded, and the violence of the colonial project is still ongoing. So welcome to our very first talk for day 2. We've got a very exciting talk. I'm super looking forward to it. The session is called Mad Poetics in Indie Games, and joining us is Xuan Nguyen. Xuan is a disabled Fey orchestral music composer, writer-poet, and illustrator designer. Their recent projects have involved the solo development of aesthetic interactive fiction games, exploring the nuances not exclusive to the following: power, trauma, madness, non-binariness, divinity, and monstrosity. Their works include Libretto, The Fairies Sing to Each Other, and the visual novels Liar, Lioness, and Ajitsumaki. Please make Xuan welcome, and I will hand it over to them.
Hi. I am Xuan Nguyen, and I'm here to talk about Mad Poetics and indie gaming. First of all, I would like to pitch, or not pitch, but I would like to invite everyone to look at the new Liar Lioness remaster I just released on itch under Phase 1, FEYXUAN. Because that I don't feature it in my talk, but that game also carries on the themes of today's talk. So with that said, with no further ado, I'll get started. So, as an introduction, games as a narrative art form provide immense potential as a vehicle for Mad Poetics. Madness is a reclaimed disability term for those with especially stigmatized neurodivergence, which is to say personality disorders, schizospectrum, dissociative identity disorders, among others. Mad Poetics, as I conceive of it, refers to poetic works whose language is influenced by the altered reality of a particular class of neurodivergence. Poetry, through its limitless flexibility of language and metaphor, meter, and symbol, invites an expression of unreality known only to the mad. And there is power in that, not only in bringing the poetic to life through language, but in the immersive world of a game, engaging visual, auditory, and touch sensations. That is to say, there's power in creating something that allows people from the consensus reality to know what kind of mad unreality you live in. So through my own experience developing Ajitsumaki, which is a winter 2021-22 game, which is my Mad Poetic visual novel about the impossibility of translating trauma, I intend to speak about the way that the language of the mad invites poetry as a medium of expression. In essence, my argument is that games provide an immersive stage for poetic translations of madness from the mad subject to the sane audience. So part 1, what does poetry have to do with games? Have you heard of Bitsy? It is a web game engine on itch.io by Adam Ledoux. And a friend of mine in the Swamp Babes collective said that a Bitsy was like a poem. If you're not familiar with Bitsy, it's a simple, hackable pixel game engine that works best for short and succinct games that, due to their brevity, often end up feeling somewhat poetic. So by what works best, I mean that have personally to me been most effective. But the glory of Bitsy is that it's a very versatile engine. But for me, the appeal is in the poetry of it. So how does that work? Through the combination of simple, rudimentary pixel graphics and brief lines of text, hardly more than one line of text appears at a time, of either introspection or dialogue, the limitations of the engine invite the same almost implicitly restrictive conditions that the medium of poetry does, the length. We are long past the ages of epic poems such as the Iliad, and a lot of contemporary poets write poems that easily fit on one page. Even nowadays, in my experience, it's hard to even see longer narrative poems in the style of T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, though you may be familiar with The Wasteland. I found that generally speaking, narrative poetry isn't in the height of fashion at the moment. However, the bitsies that resemble poems are forms of succinct narrative poetry. In the creation of a teeny tiny bitsy sprite, the developer is creating a fictional character, and it places the words on the screen within a storytelling context of fiction. There's character and there's narrative. The poem becomes a narrative because of the sprite. And so within the storytelling context of fiction, the brevity transforms these lines of introspective dialogue into something with the potential to be precious and poignant, like a poem. Bitsies, just like poems, do not have any space for wasted words. This is all to say, the idea of using games as a medium for poetic storytelling isn't so far-fetched at all, especially nowadays. And this is true especially in queer indie circles where bitsies are particularly popular. The emergence of bitsy games in the indie scene proves that poetic games do have a place in the world of indie gaming, and they can live and thrive there. So part 2, what does poetry have to do with your games? My games? Yeah, where I started. I started out as a prose fiction writer with a poetic style before moving into narrative poetry, writing the types of unfashionable 3 to 5 page poems, and then into hybrid prose poetry, not long-form narrative novellas in verse. In other words, poetics as a practice was already tied into my fate, and I started out there well before I got to games. So Ajitsumaki is a work of Mad Poetics as a hybrid prose poetry game that incorporates metrical and rhythmal wordplay that lacks any formal categorization, but still maintains a naturally metronomic structure. In simpler words, there are some sections in verse that look like what you think a poem would look like, and some sections that resemble typical prose as you'd see in your usual visual novel. The verse sections also rhyme according to a difficult to identify pattern while still feeling natural. In Ajitsumaki, there is no clear delineation between poetry sections and prose sections, but rather smooth, fused transitions between the two. Chapters 4 and 5 have a tighter metrical structure, which means it more closely resembles formal poetry, but this is because they're from the perspective of another character whose sections are always in verse. So this all begs the question, why poetry? The answer to that is prose fiction is concerned with the sequence. Poetry is concerned with the moment. So the first reason I'd like to talk about is the contrast between the restrictive temporal linearity of prose fiction and the atemporal emphasis on the intensity of the moment in poetry. In other words, prose requires a strict timeline that goes from past to present to future, and poetry has no such time-related restriction. Because poetry is concerned with the moment and not the sequence, poetry has the ability to evoke the immediacy, the sheer intensity, the immersion of visceral vulnerability that happens when someone confesses to you how they're really feeling. Poetry doesn't care about before or after. It cares about the here and now. Poetry concerns itself with the immediacy of the present. It's prose that forces you to sequence that moment between many others that have a restrictively tight linear sequence in a timeline in order to make a plot coherent. Prose fiction necessitates a compelling logical sequence of events, which most people call plot. In juxtaposition, poetry does not require temporality and linearity. As someone who exists in a frequently amnesic and atemporal state, it is needless to say that linear time as well as logical events are a struggle. Luckily, a poem does not happen in 1, 2, 3, but rather 3, 2, 1, or 2, 3, 1, or any combination thereof is permitted. Because of that, I feel like that disruption in time reflects my madness much more honestly than attempting to rig my own history. my own experiences, my own life, into a forcibly and falsely linear timeline. So, traditional prose fiction's temporal linearity is so strict that many writers even diagram it in the typical 3-act plot structure of beginning, middle, and end, or the 5-act plot structure of exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution. In my experience in the university workshop, even the technique of flashback is most often used in a manner that places the past events firmly in contrast to the present in a very absolute, distinct, and easily identifiable manner. In my own experience, flashbacks make it anything but easy to tell when they're happening or when you are. That's all to say, the resistance to temporal linearity in poetry is an immense part of its allure as a medium to me. It doesn't matter when you are in a poem. It matters who or how you are. Poetry rarely begs the question of when, of where in the timeline of the narrator's life is this happening. It doesn't matter. That's not the point. What matters is how you are feeling. It took me a long time to realize a lot of prose fiction cares about the sequence of cause and effect, the sequence of events, and much, much less about the intimacy of emotional development or the engagement of interpersonal or psychological trauma, and particularly how madness shapes a unique and unreliable unreality that nevertheless is extremely intimate, vulnerable, and intensely emotive. So what I'd like to speak about next is something that's taught in Poetry 101, which is that the poet does not equal the speaker. One of the reasons why I am so drawn to poetry is that for me, every poem is a confession. And also for me, I rarely confess things about myself when I speak about myself directly. So I confess them through characters and iterations of the truth. A rookie mistake is for people to conflate the speaker with the poet. The speaker of a poem refers to the voice of a poem, to who is narrating it. And while some poets do claim that they and the speaker are one and the same, many others view the speaker as a narrative persona, their poet voice. I take this one step further than most speaker poets by creating divine and monstrous fictional characters and narratives that are derived from genuine traumas and emotions and fragments of selves and experiences, but who are not me in the same way that the speaker is not the poet. My madness comes into play because I use these characters and their narratives and interpersonal relationships as trauma processing paradigms through which I understand myself and the world. My friend gave me a good set of symbolism through which to view this whole creative process. They once said, if you break a mirror, you just make more mirrors. I feel like that represents my process of fiction, shattering a mirror to make more mirrors. Every smaller individual mirror fragment is one of my stories, which exists as both a singular mirror that functions on its own, as well as a mirror that is part of a larger reflection, my reflection. So, what is beyond the veil? One enormous reason why poetry draws me in so deeply is because it's almost a process of making veils. There is the poet beyond the veil, whose shape you can almost make out, but not quite. Never quite. There's always the mystique of the barely there gossamer separating you from the vision. Poetry is the most revealing and obfuscating medium. For me, poetry has a kind of raw, visceral vulnerability that expresses thought in a much more genuine way to me in my madness than unmusical dry prose does. But the methods of expression that poetry possesses, the very lyricism that makes it ring so true, those are methods of obfuscation. Through the tricks of the trade, the poetic devices such as symbolism and metaphor and white space, many people view poets as obfuscating their message, but I view these practices of wordplay and language uses as revealing the truth. Some things can't be said directly. Some truths are too hard to confess, to say them as they are, because sometimes telling it like it is feels like a form of evisceration. Through the inherent obfuscation of poetry through poetic devices, certain intimate confessions can be made without the blood-red threat of vulnerability. With no dressing up and no potential to merit that raw truth-telling as a form of art, can be too much to tell the truth and risk people finding no value in it. Telling a traumatic story or a sacred emotion of one's life as though it were dry as sandpaper can in itself almost be a falsehood. It can be a sublimation of experience that might be so powerful as to feel sublime by telling it in the method of the more socially acceptable, socially appropriate, mundane. Sometimes, in order to convey the intensity of trauma or emotion, you have to reflect it in the way you convey your experience, in your expression of the truth. So, where does madness fit into this? For me, I have this thing called clanging, but basically it means I sort words by sound rather than meaning. This makes rhyming and meter very easy for me. I've mentioned trauma and emotion. As for emotion, personality disorders like borderline personality disorder and mood disorders such as bipolar disorder can create emotional extremes that people without these disorders cannot even imagine. Therefore, expressing the intensity of these emotions through the usage of poetic devices seems like one of the few ways to express the true depth of them to an audience that may not otherwise understand in plain language. As for my clanging, the musicality of poetry, the meter and the symbolism of the rhyme, these come naturally to me. They come more naturally than fitting myself and my thoughts to the strict grammatical style structures of traditional prose fiction. Wikipedia defines clanging as referring to a mode of speech characterized by the association of words based upon sound rather than concepts. This is obviously quite hard to imagine if you do not have this, but basically it means that when I write, my automatic process provides me a word that reaches for sound first, then meaning. So my hybrid narrative poetry work always seems to have this internal metronome where it's hard to say why exactly or by what rule it is happening, but there's a fluid cohesion that makes the rhyming feel effortless and natural. It is effortless and natural. There are extremes of clanging, which one of my friends has sometimes, where words are organized almost solely by sound, and meaning can barely be parsed from it. While I have come close to that loss of language, I am far from it now on my current medications, which aren't the right answer for everyone, including my friend, but they have changed my life. Anyway, because people don't look at my writing and see the mad queer in the attic, they only see what seems to them an act of deliberate obfuscation of meaning. They see a refusal to be clear and direct, to just tell it like it is. They see my clanging-infused metrical and rhythmical timekeeping, and they see it as ways to hide the truth, rather than ways to reveal it. But like I was talking about before, in some ways, poetic devices do more work to approximate the intensity of a sacred emotion or a traumatic experience than saying it plainly and directly would. So how does it all come together into a mad poetic game? Ajitsumaki is a 2021-22 visual novel about the impossibility of translating trauma. The only way some of the trauma can be expressed is through sections of rhyming verse and symbolism. This can be seen in the very opening of Ochi. There will be a discussion of suicidal ideation warning from here onward. In 10 years' time, if I cannot find a reason to live, I will die. It is simple, I shall not lie. If I cannot find a reason to live, I will die. A fallen camellia is a beheading. Every time, every petal falling at once, a severing. When I fall, I will not scatter like cherry blossoms on the wind. When I fall, it will be a severing. So this is a section, this is from the opening of Ajitsumaki. The last line about the camellia is the tagline for the entire game. It's because the Japanese phrase Ajitsumaki means fallen camellia, which in samurai times used to be an ill omen because of the way the flowers fell from the tree, as one whole flower resembled a beheading. Compared to cherry blossoms, which scatter petal by petal, camellias fall whole from the stem. However, this obscure bit of symbolism was unknown to my friend, who spent a decade and a half with Japanese as a second language, so it seems relatively uncommon, and in English, it isn't a concept at all. The bit about cherry blossoms scattering is the difference between chiru and ochiru. Chiru refers to a scattering motion, something that falls piece by piece, like sakura. Cherry blossoms, which fall petal by petal. but it can also refer to a noble death. Ochire refers to things that fall as a whole, such as the camellia, the tsubaki, Ajitsumaki, which fall as entire blooms from the stem, and as previously mentioned in samurai times, were symbolic of beheading. Taken all together, Ajitsumaki is about wanting to die before your time. Instead of dying a noble death, ashes scattering like sakura in the wind, you die completely and subtly in a movement as abrupt and irreversible as beheading. This is all to say, the poetry and the bilingual symbolism and the trauma are all inextricably intertwined. Ochitsubaki's description is a game about the impossibility of translating trauma. It has 3 language modes: Japanese, English, and Japanese translation. The English and the Japanese are distinct retellings of the same story, delivered in the way most appropriate to the cultural context of the language's strengths. One of the implicit arguments of the game is that poetry is like a foreign language. One of the implicit arguments of the game is that poetry is like a foreign language in the way that native speakers will be unable to understand it, to translate it into words that make sense to them. For native English speakers unversed in poetry, and perhaps even for poets who are not mad, ironically, the most parsable retelling of the story might be in the English translation of the Japanese, which is in plain prose and is the most translation-like of the translations. So to wrap up, what does madness have to do with translation? What does translation have to do with poetry? And what does this all have to do with games? So the whole act of writing poetry, for me, is an act of translation. To me, a translation refers to the act of communicating something from one culture to another. In my journey of learning Japanese, there's much more to the language than the words. To translate something only on the literal language level, the word-by-word level, is inevitably a failed translation. There's the entire cultural context that built a language to accommodate its particular societal needs. And even within that, there are failures of language to communicate the needs of the marginalized. Madness contains its own multitudes that I think, for my particular kind of madness, can be isolating in its unreality that is known to you and you alone. But through poetry, through symbolism, metaphor, meter, rhyme, all the tricks of the trade, through these methods of obfuscation, you can find the truth. So what does madness have to do with translation? Mad folks translate themselves every time we try to explain the bizarre and the strange, mundane realities of our neurodivergences that are so heavily stigmatized as forms of demonic wickedness. Whenever we sacrifice our genuine truths for ones that others can understand, we are translating ourselves from cultures of our own madness to cultures that our saner counterparts can understand. Poetry is the vehicle, the mode of translation. Through poetry's devices, to an extent you can replicate for a sane audience the emotive intensity, the experience of the bizarre and the absurd, the atemporality and more realities of madness. Games, through visual, audio, and touch sensations, have the power to augment the power of poetry. Poetry is a text-based medium that has the potential to be visual using white space, though there are popular standards of formatting as well. By adding music and illustration and user interaction, if only by clicking to advance the page, you can build anticipation, amplify tension, and immerse the audience more fully in the world of your own madness and in the translations of it you are providing. So once again, altogether, games provide an immersive stage for poetic translations of madness from the mad subject to the sane audience. It is through mad poetic games that I seek to be understood, and I invite my fellow mad folks to explore this stage, to see it as a modicum of expression you wish to engage in. It is my hope to encourage more mad game developers to play in the space with me. And if you aren't sure the world needs something like your voice, rest assured, even if the world doesn't, I do. Thank you for coming to my talk. The last few things I would like to plug are, once again, my itch. I'm Xuan, Feyxuan, on itch.io. And I recently opened an online store where you can get my poetry books related to Ajitsumaki, and soon to be beanies, shirts, and some charms and stickers and stuff. Um, I'll hand it back to the Freeplay folks, unless there's something else I gotta do. Please guide me here.